We're going to get started in a few minutes. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Just going to give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Just waiting for a few more people to join. Harry, why don't we get started?
Okay, Kathy, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome to another fantastic NASCA webinar. We've had so many great ones, so thank you for joining us again. My name is Carrie Shannard-Koonders. I'm the Executive Director of the South Dakota Board of Pharmacy, and I chair NASCA's Education Committee. I'll be hosting this afternoon's webinar along with Kathy Keogh from NASCA. Hopefully you've read these scrolling materials while waiting to enter the webinar and have seen the information regarding our sponsors, NASCA disclaimer, housekeeping items and announcements. Today's webinar and all of our webinars are made possible through the generous support of our sponsors. So thank you, sponsors. And thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for today's webinar, HHS Cannabis Rescheduling Recommendations, a long, strange trip with potholes. What a fun title, and I believe we'll all enjoy it. So we are thrilled to have an extremely qualified expert, attorney Larry Houck, director of a law firm I think most of us in this business are familiar with, Hyman, Phelps and McNamara, PC, representing us. Please allow me to introduce him. Larry provides counsel on DEA regulatory and enforcement issues. His 37-year career has encompassed conducting inspections, investigations, and negotiating on behalf of both the government and industry. Mr. Houck focuses on controlled substances, including prescription drugs and regulated chemicals, helping clients navigate federal and state licensing, registration, and compliance issues. He also engages on cannabis marijuana regulation, including cannabidiol and hemp issues. Mr. Houck counsels clients throughout the closed distribution supply chain on administrative, civil, and criminal proceedings. In situations where clients face enforcement actions, Mr. Houck has extensive understanding of DEA's approach and priorities. He advises pharmaceutical and chemical companies, including manufacturers, distributors, pharmacies, and healthcare facilities on DEA inspections and accountability audits. By working with clients to review their business policies and practice, he helps create the infrastructure to ensure compliant registration, reporting, record keeping, and security. Before joining Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara in 2001, Mr. Houck served as a DEA diversion investigator and policy staff coordinator for 15 years. As a diversion investigator in the Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon field offices, Mr. Houck conducted a full range of regulatory and criminal investigations and inspections of controlled substances and chemical registrants. As a staff coordinator for DEA's Office of Diversion Control Liaison and Policy Section, he advised government officials and pharmaceutical and healthcare professionals on the Controlled Substances Act and DEA regulations. Mr. Houck drafted and helped implement DEA's diversion control regulations on issues that included pain management. Welcome, Mr. Houck. The floor is yours, and we look forward to this webinar.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Happy New Year and welcome to NASCSA's first webinar of 2024. You really didn't have to read all that stuff. I apologize. I have been involved with NASCSA for over 25 years, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group about such an important and timely topic. Today, I am going to focus on the recent recommendation by the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, for DEA to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, to Schedule 3. I will discuss some of the impacts that rescheduling cannabis would have federally and on the states. And although the title of this webinar is HHS's Cannabis Rescheduling Recommendation, a long, strange trip with potholes, it could easily have been rescheduling cannabis. Will the grass really be greener? As Carrie indicated, my career in the controlled substances arena began with DEA over 35 years ago. That was back when marijuana was viewed by most as a bad thing. We've seen a lot of changes in the ensuing years about how cannabis has been perceived, regulated, and accepted. First, a few housekeeping notes. My slides are pretty detailed. I designed them so that they could also be used as a reference tool long after the webinar is over. I also note at the outset that there are more questions and speculation at this point about cannabis rescheduling than hard answers. I will answer questions at the end of the webinar, and if I do not get to your questions, I will follow up afterwards via email. My contact information is included in the slides, so feel free to contact me by telephone or email. So let's see. Okay, I think it's actually working. This is great. So last month, 6 Democratic governors thanked President Biden for his leadership to reschedule cannabis. They argued in their letter that cannabis should be rescheduled, acknowledging that FDA based its recommendation to reschedule solely on science and medicine. But they also asserted that rescheduling also increases public health and safety, is sound public policy, and is a big win for the states. They agreed that the cannabis industry is permanent, it's here to stay, and that the states have implemented strong regulations, and that supporting the state regulated marketplace is essential for the safety of the American people. The governor said that rescheduling to Schedule 3 would protect the public against more dangerous drug use because cannabis products sold in states where they are legal are significantly safer than the myriad alternatives, including opioids. The governors noted that state regulated cannabis would require age verification, packaging and labeling standards, testing, warning symbols or statements, and would allow for tracking products from seed to sale. Their letter, however, gives a false impression that rescheduling cannabis to Schedule 3 under the federal CSA, the Controlled Substances Act, means descheduling and decontrol. What the governors also failed to mention are the far-reaching implications of rescheduling cannabis federally and on the states. So slide 5 is sort of an overview of my presentation. I'm not going to go into what I'm going to go into, but for reference purposes, this is sort of a roadmap of where I'm going. In October 2022, President Biden directed the HHS Secretary and Attorney General to initiate the administrative process to review expeditiously how marijuana is scheduled under federal law. The president also pardoned all prior federal offenses of simple cannabis possession and encouraged governors to issue similar pardons. Then, this August, media outlets reported and HHS and DEA officials confirmed that HHS had recommended that DEA reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and that the National Institute on Drug Abuse agreed. At the time, Bloomberg News reported that it had seen HHS's letter to DEA stating that, quote, FDA considered 8 factors that determine the control status of the substance and recommended that marijuana be placed in the Schedule 3 category, end quote. By recommending rescheduling to Schedule 3, HHS has made a determination that cannabis no longer meets Schedule 2 criteria under the CSA, and by leapfrogging to Schedule 3, that it does not meet Schedule 2 criteria either. HHS recommendation falls far short of recommending total control that a number of cannabis advocates have been wishing for. Should DEA follow the rescheduling recommendation, federal law would more closely align with that of some of the states that currently allow some form of cannabis for medical use. But federal law would still remain conflicted with those states that have legalized cannabis for recreational use. We surmise that the letter that Bloomberg News saw was actually the cover letter of HHS's recommendation, because we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the recommendation. And this is what we received, a lot of gray. We also went to HHS's Freedom of Information page and found less text of the letter redacted. The more complete letter to DEA states that HHS was making a recommendation on marijuana, that is botanical cannabis, within the CSA's definition of marijuana, based on the required 8-factor analysis. This is what was posted. More text appeared, but still leaves a lot to the imagination. A lot of holes there. In order to understand HHS's recommendation and what may be DEA's subsequent analysis, first, some context. The CSA defines marijuana as all parts of the plant Cannabis sativa L, whether growing or not, its seeds, resin extracted from any part of the plant, and every compound, manufacture, salt derivative, mixture, or preparation of the plant, its seeds, or its resin. The CSA definition of marijuana expressly excludes hemp, mature stalks, fiber produced from mature stalks, oil or cake made from seeds, and any other compound, manufacture, salt derivative, mixture, or preparation of the mature stalks, except for resin from the stalks, fiber, oil, or cake, or sterilized seeds that are incapable of germination. Cannabis and any substance derived from parts of the cannabis plant within the definition of marijuana is currently a Schedule I controlled substance under the federal CSA. There are different varieties and strains of cannabis plants containing more than 525 natural constituents that include over 100 cannabinoids. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, that is Delta-9 THC, and cannabidiol, CBD, are the primary cannabinoids and most plentiful parts of the plant included within the CSA definition of marijuana. We know that to recommend removal from Schedule I, FDA had to determine that cannabis has a currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States. We note that cannabis was first documented for medicinal use in 400 AD. In the US Pharmacopoeia mentioned cannabis as far back as 1850. Delta-9 THC is the component in cannabis with the psychoactive properties that produces euphoria or a high. Delta-9 THC is scheduled separately from marijuana and is also a Schedule I substance. Neither the CSA nor DEA regulations until very recently distinguished between high THC and low THC cannabis plant varieties. To date, about 38 states authorize cannabis in different dosage formulations for specific medical conditions, despite it being in Schedule I under the CSA, which by definition has no currently accepted medical use and treatment in the US. Reported health benefits for Delta-9 THC include the prevention of nausea and vomiting from cancer and the promotion of appetite. Adverse effects of Delta-9 THC have included impaired coordination, altered thinking, panic, delusions, and hallucinations. The states vary as to how patients can qualify for access to cannabis. Approved qualifying medical conditions vary by state, but typically include post-traumatic stress disorder, pain, cancer, multiple sclerosis, glaucoma, HIV/AIDS, Crohn's disease, epilepsy, muscle spasticity, and nausea. FDA has also received adverse event reports involving Delta-8 THC products that include vomiting, hallucination, trouble standing, and loss of consciousness. Products containing Delta-8 THC are sold online and in brick-and-mortar stores. Delta-8 THC products are typically manufactured from CBD derived from hemp. Delta-8 THC has psychoactive and intoxicating effects similar to Delta-9 THC. And even though it is derived from hemp, which through the Farm Bill of 2018, THC in hemp was excluded from control, Delta-8 THC appears to be regulated federally as a Schedule I substance. And to date, about 17 states have banned or restricted the sale of products containing Delta-8 THC. Scheduling under the Controlled Substances Act. CSA requirements apply to all DEA-registered controlled substance handlers. The specific requirements vary depending on the type of registered activity and the schedule of the controlled substances involved. The CSA classifies controlled substances into one of 5 schedules, depending upon their potential for abuse. Schedule I drugs have a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States. Drugs that have an accepted medical use are classified in Schedule 2 through 5 based on their relative potential for abuse and physical and psychological dependence. Among these drugs, Schedule 2 have the greatest potential and greatest abuse potential, and those in Schedule 5, the least abuse potential. Schedule 1 criteria under the CSA are include drugs that have a high potential for abuse. Again, no currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States, and they lack accepted safety for use, even under medical supervision. Cannabis-related substances in Schedule 1 include marijuana and parts of the cannabis sativa plant within the definition of marijuana within the CSA, marijuana extract, and THC not in hemp, including Delta-9 THC, Delta-8 THC, and synthetic CBD. Schedule 2 criteria under the federal CSA are drugs that have a high potential for abuse, currently accepted medical use in treatment in the U.S., and their abuse may lead to severe psychological or physical dependence. Cannabis-related substances in Schedule 2 include FDA-approved synthetic dronabinol in an oral solution, particularly a product called Syndros, and FDA-approved synthetic nabilone, a product called Kesamet. Schedule 3 criteria under the CSA include drugs that have a potential for abuse less than Schedule 1 or 2 substances. They have a currently accepted medical use in treatment in the U.S., and their abuse may lead to moderate or low physical dependence or high psychological dependence. Cannabis-related substances in Schedule 3 include the FDA-approved synthetic dronabinol product, Marinol, which is an oral solution in sesame oil encapsulated in soft gelatin capsules. Not controlled include, among cannabis-related products, hemp and hemp-derived products, THC in hemp, CBD and products derived from parts of the cannabis sativa plant excluded from the definition of marijuana, and FDA-approved drugs in finished form containing cannabis-derived CBD with no more than 0.1% THC. You'll remember that Epidiolex is pretty much the only drug within this category of non-scheduled cannabis drugs. It was originally scheduled in Schedule 5 back in September 2018 and decontrolled by DEA in August of 2020. The CSA requires analysis of 8 statutory factors for scheduling substances of abuse. Requires and looks at the drug's actual or relative potential for abuse, the drug's scientific evidence of its pharmacological effect, if known, the current state of scientific knowledge regarding the substance, the drug's history and current pattern of abuse, the drug's scope, duration, and significance of abuse, risk to the public health, the drug's psychic or physiological dependence liability, and whether the drug is an immediate precursor of a substance that's already controlled. The FDA conducts the 8-factor analysis and recommends scheduling, rescheduling, or descheduling. FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Controlled Substance staff conducts the analysis and makes recommendations. The FDA Commissioner, with 90 concurrence, provides analysis and recommendations to the HHS Assistant Secretary for Health. HHS forwards FDA's analysis and recommendation to DEA. DEA completes its own 8-factor analysis and scheduling determination. If FDA and HHS recommends that a substance not be controlled, DEA can't control it. HHS's recommendation as to scientific and medical matters is binding on DEA. DEA, with HHS and FDA input, classifies controlled substances into one of the 5 schedules. HHS and DEA last considered rescheduling cannabis in 2016. DEA had received petitions from a private citizen and from the governors of Rhode Island and Washington to remove cannabis from Schedule 1. They asserted that cannabis had accepted medical use in the United States, was safe for use under medical supervision, and had no or low potential for abuse. DEA denied the petitions to reschedule. Since 2013, there's been a great deal of movement on the cannabis front to bring us to where we are now. In 2013, in response to the states authorizing and legalizing cannabis as it remained a Schedule I substance federally, DEA issued in what's become known as the Cole Memo that it was unlikely to take enforcement action against cannabis-related businesses operating in compliance with state law in those states where they implicated any of 8 enforcement actions. The Cole Memo encouraged strong and effective regulatory and enforcement systems in the states to control cultivation, distribution, sale, and possession of marijuana. DOJ said that it would not go after marijuana-related businesses unless they violated any one of 8 priorities, including the prevention of distribution of marijuana to minors, preventing revenue from sale of marijuana to criminal enterprises, gangs, and cartels, and preventing the diversion of marijuana from states where it is legal under state law in some form to other states. In January 2018, Attorney General Sessions rescinded prior DOJ guidance on enforcement discretion with respect to cannabis, including the Cole Memo. He directed federal prosecutors to weigh all relevant considerations, including enforcement priorities set by the Attorney General. Attorney General Barr, about a year later, stated during his confirmation that he disagreed with efforts by the states to legalize marijuana, but consistent with the Cole Memo, would not go after marijuana businesses in states where activity is legal. Then in February 2021, during his confirmation, he said that it was not the best use of DOJ's limited resources to pursue prosecutions of those who are complying with the laws in states that have legalized and are effectively regulating marijuana. Also, in 2014, Congress passed the Agricultural Act. The Agricultural Act of 2014 authorized growing and cultivating industrial hemp under limited circumstances where it was legal under state law. Industrial hemp was defined as the cannabis sativa plant in any part of the plant with a THC concentration of not more than 0.3% on a dry weight basis. The Agricultural Act of 2014 did not amend the CSA or any Food, Drug, or Cosmetic Act requirement. 4 years later, Congress passed the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, also known as the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill removed hemp from the CSA definition of marijuana and excludes THC in hemp from control under the CSA. It directed USDA to issue regulations and guidance as expeditiously as possible, and it allowed hemp production in the states, but either required state licenses or a USDA license. DEA issued an interim final rule in August 2020. It issued an IFR rather than a notice of proposed rulemaking for public comment because amendments to the regulations merely conform to the amendments already made to the CSA by the Farm Bill that had already taken effect by August 2020. Also, DEA announced in August 2016 that it would issue additional registrations to manufacture cannabis for research. The demand for needed quantities and varieties of cannabis for medical and scientific research had increased dramatically over the last decade or so. For 50 years, DEA had registered only one cannabis manufacturer, restricting all production for research to a single grower. DEA believed that limiting cultivation to a single grower decreased the likelihood of diversion while meeting the limited demand for research-grade cannabis. Right after its announcement in 2016, DEA received about 38 applications for registrations to cultivate cannabis for research and has issued at least a handful of registrations since 2020. To comply with the CSA and issue registrations consistent with the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, DEA revised its regulations for it to take possession of cannabis from registered manufacturers after harvest and to maintain the exclusive right to import, export, wholesale, and maintain stocks of cannabis and its resin. So DEA took on a prominent role in cannabis manufacturing and distribution. DEA had often been an impediment in the past in loosening of cannabis restrictions, but assumed a new role, that of cannabis research facilitator. And demand for research-grade cannabis has increased dramatically, and DEA has progressively increased annual aggregate production quotas since 2013. The aggregate quota for cannabis was only 21 kilograms in 2013 and increased to 650 kilograms a year later. The production quota for 2023 and the proposed quota for 2024 is 6,675 kilograms, almost 318 times greater than 213's production quota. Back to the HHS and DEA analyses of 2016. In 2016, HHS conducted the 8-factor analysis and concluded that cannabis continued to meet the scheduling criteria for remaining in Schedule 1. HHS found that cannabis had a high potential for abuse and lacked accepted safety for use, even under medical supervision. Most important, HHS found that cannabis had no currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States. Again, HHS's scientific and medical finding was binding on DEA. While DEA also made specific findings relative to the 8 factors, without HHS finding that cannabis had a currently accepted medical use and treatment, DEA had to deny any petition to reschedule out of Schedule 1. A drug was considered to have a currently accepted medical use and treatment for purposes of the CSA if it was the subject of an approved new drug application, an NDA, under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But FDA had not approved any drug product containing cannabis for marketing. So DEA turned to a 5-part test that it had established when denying cannabis rescheduling way back in 1992. Under that test, a drug was considered to have a currently accepted medical use only if it met all 5 of the elements. Those elements are: the drug's chemistry is known and reproducible, there are adequate safety studies, there are adequate and well-controlled studies proving efficacy of the drug is accepted by qualified experts, and the scientific evidence is widely available. DEA found that none of the 5 elements, including DEA found that cannabis met none of the 5 elements of the test, concluding that it did not have a currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States. Now, in order for HHS to recommend in 2023, 7 years later, the DEA rescheduled cannabis in Schedule 3, the agency had to have concluded that the substance now has an approved medical use and treatment in the United States. We're unsure how it arrived at that conclusion, unless it is because of FDA's 2018 approval of Epidiolex containing CBD derived from cannabis, or that cannabis now meets the 5-factor test. But most importantly, DEA asserted as a threshold matter in its 2016 that the only schedule cannabis could have been rescheduled to for the United States to comply with its obligations under international treaties was Schedule 2, because the U.S. is a signatory to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, and signatories are obligated to maintain certain control provisions related to the drugs controlled under that treaty. And in fact, Congress enacted many of the provisions of the CSA in order to ensure U.S. compliance with the Single Convention. So the CSA requires the Attorney General, and by delegation, the DEA Administrator, to carry out treaty obligations without regard to the findings or the procedures required under the CSA to schedule, deschedule, or reschedule substances. The Single Convention defines cannabis to include the flowering or fruiting tops of the cannabis plant, excluding the seeds and leaves when not accompanied by the tops, from which the resin has not been extracted. This definition is less inclusive than the CSA's definition of marijuana, which includes all parts of the cannabis plant except the mature stalks, sterilized seeds, oil from the seeds, and certain derivatives. Cannabis and cannabis resin were listed in Schedule 1 and Schedule 4 of the Single Convention. The Single Convention, unlike the CSA, imposes more stringent controls on Schedule 4 substances than on Schedule 1 substances. Schedule 4 substances under the Single Convention are highly addictive and rarely used in medical practice, whereas Schedule 1 substances are highly addictive and liable to abuse or convertible to drugs similarly addictive and liable to abuse. Under the Single Convention, Schedule 4 substances are also listed in Schedule 1 and subject to the same controls as Schedule 1 drugs, but subject to additional controls. Under 21 U.S.C. 811D, the DEA Administrator had to control cannabis in the schedule he deemed most appropriate to comply with U.S. obligations under the Single Convention. Prior cannabis rescheduling proceedings had established that cannabis scheduling in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 of the CSA was, quote, necessary as well as sufficient to satisfy our international obligations, end quote, under the Single Convention. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in the 1977 case of Normal v. DEA stated, quote, several requirements imposed by the Single Convention would not be met if cannabis and cannabis resin were placed in CSA Schedules 3, 4, or 5. For example, the Single Convention requires import and export permits for cannabis as a Schedule 1 or a Schedule 4 substance. Were cannabis to have been rescheduled to Schedule 3 under the CSA, import and export permits would not be required. In addition, the Single Convention requires manufacturing quotas for Schedule 1 and Schedule 4 substances that would not be required for cannabis rescheduled to Schedule 3 under the CSA. When DEA denied rescheduling in August 2016, cannabis was in both Schedule 1 and Schedule 4 under the Single Convention. The CSA required the administrator to control cannabis under the schedule he deemed most appropriate for carrying out obligations under the treaty, regardless of the 8-factor analysis. But the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs removed cannabis and cannabis resin from Schedule 4 of the Single Convention in December 2020. So, might DEA follow FDA's recommendation and reschedule cannabis in Schedule 3 under the CSA now that it is only in Schedule 1 of the Single Convention? No, because cannabis would still require manufacturing quotas, which the CSA requires for Schedule 2 substances, but not for those in Schedule 3. And the treaty requires import and export permits for international transactions involving cannabis, while the CSA requires permits for all Schedule 1 and 2 substances and Schedule 3 narcotic substances, but only declarations for Schedule 3 non-narcotic substances, which would include cannabis. So with cannabis removed as a Schedule 4 substance under the Single Convention, The DEA administrator is still constrained from rescheduling cannabis to any less restrictive schedule than Schedule 2. That is, unless DEA is inclined to reschedule cannabis to Schedule 3 and then imposes manufacturing quota and import and export permit requirements mandated by the Single Convention on Cannabis that is not required for other Schedule 3 substances. We do not believe that DEA would reschedule cannabis in Schedule 3 because it would then require quotas and permits, resulting in the agency and registrants having to straddle requirements into schedules. As long as the U.S. remains a signatory of the Single Convention, under the CSA, cannabis manufacturers, importers, exporters, and distributors will always be required to obtain DEA registrations, and prescriptions will be required for dispensing cannabis to individuals. Adherence with these Single Convention requirements would seem to prohibit DEA from ever descheduling and decontrolling cannabis altogether. Rescheduling implications and implications under the federal CSA. CSA requirements apply to all DEA registered controlled substance handlers. These include manufacturers, distributors, importers, exporters, pharmacies, and practitioners. And specific requirements vary depending on the type of registered activity and the schedule of the controlled substances. DEA rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to either Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 would have significant federal CSA implications. Slide 48 compares the differences between the requirements for Schedule 2 controlled substances and those in Schedule 3. It also summarizes the differences between Schedule 1 substances and non-controlled substances under the CSA. Were cannabis to be rescheduled in Schedule 2, it would require manufacturing quotas, import and export permits, DEA 222 order forms or their equivalent for distribution. It would require written prescriptions with no refills, and it would require secure storage in a safe steel cabinet or a vault. In contrast, placement of cannabis in Schedule 3 would not require manufacturing quotas, would not require import or export permits, but rather just declarations, nor would it require DEA 222s for distribution, just invoices. In addition, cannabis in Schedule 3 would allow for written, telephone, or faxed prescriptions with refills and storage in a cage or masonry enclosure. What's very interesting is DEA stated in its 2016 notice to allow additional cannabis cultivators for research that an applicant's involvement with cannabis activities in compliance with state law in violation of federal law, quote, may weigh heavily against granting the registration, end quote. This would have been activity in states that authorized cannabis for medical and recreational use. But in 2024 and beyond, how will DEA actually handle applications for registration submitted by those practitioners, pharmacies, cultivators, distributors, and researchers while cannabis was a Schedule 1 substance under the CSA? Might DEA issue some type of amnesty for such applicants? Perhaps. And while DEA is the primary federal authority that enforces the CSA and its regulations, the states, commonwealths, and territories also regulate controlled substances on a more local level. Most states have their own Controlled Substances Act and regulations mirroring the federal CSA and DEA regulations. The states, through a separate Controlled Substance Authority, Pharmacy Board, Department of Health, or legislature, impose scheduling, registration, record keeping, reporting, and security requirements on entities handling legitimate controlled substances within their jurisdictions. Some states have agencies that regulate cannabis exclusively. To date, about 38 states authorize cannabis in different dosage formulations for specific medical conditions. About 24 states, including the District of Columbia, have legalized adult recreational use of cannabis, and all cannabis use is illegal in about 5 states. So depending upon the state, substances of abuse are scheduled, rescheduled, or descheduled if, as under the federal CSA, they meet certain scheduling criteria. The scheduling criteria, though differing by state, are generally consistent with CSA criteria. At least half the states require the same 8-factor analysis as the CSA, but some states have fewer criteria factors, like New Mexico and Oregon, while others have more factors, including Illinois and Wyoming. Federal rescheduling of any drug impacts each state differently, but even more so with cannabis, given its widely different legal status among the states. Any federal scheduling action will require a handful of states to automatically schedule, reschedule, or deschedule a drug consistent with federal action. This may prove diametrically opposite to the state's current allowance of cannabis for medical or recreational purposes. For at least 16 states, federal scheduling actions automatically require them to control the drug consistent with the CSA unless there is an objection. Those states generally require a public hearing, after which the state authority publishes its decision to follow or not follow the federal scheduling action. A number of states have discretionary scheduling authority not tied to federal scheduling at all. Florida's scheduling is not tied to federal scheduling, but scheduling under the CSA is admissible, while Nevada and Virginia may consider the findings of FDA and DEA. A couple states allow substances of abuse to be on a more restrictive schedule than what it is on the federal CSA. Should DEA reschedule cannabis in either Schedule 2 or 3, consistent rescheduling will take effect automatically in many states, unless the state objects and actively undertakes some action within 30 days of the federal action. States that automatically schedule, reschedule, or deschedule, depending on what the feds do, may lack the authority to schedule cannabis more independently. For some states that already authorize cannabis for medical purposes, this may be a big change. But for states that, for some states that already authorize cannabis for medical purposes, this may not be a big change. But for states that don't allow cannabis for medical or recreational use, or those states that authorize cannabis for recreational use, this will represent a sea change and a potential culture shift. It would behoove authorities to prepare now for federal cannabis rescheduling by assessing and understanding how it will impact their individual state. The federal CSA does not preempt state law unless there is a positive conflict between a CSA provision and state law, so that they cannot consistently stand together. DEA has historically taken the position that in conflicts between the CSA and state law, the stricter of the two prevails. Were DEA to reschedule cannabis to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, and states reschedule in a less restrictive schedule or allow continued recreational use without prescriptions, how will DEA and DOJ respond? Will DOJ and DEA continue to exercise enforcement discretion? Attorney General Garland may have provided a clue during his confirmation when he said it was not the best use of DOJ's limited resources to prosecute those complying with the laws in states that have legalized marijuana and are, quote, effectively regulating marijuana, end quote. Might DOJ and DEA determine that those particular states are not, quote, effectively regulating marijuana, end quote, and forgo enforcement discretion? We'll have to see. And now I think I'm ready for questions.
Super. Thank you.
Oh, you're
That
very
was
welcome.
that was very good. Kathy,
Lot to unpack there, Carrie.
yeah, that was a quick run through too of a lot of information. Kathy, do you have any questions?
Yes, so one question which I actually was thinking the same thing about. So I'll just run through, and if anybody has any questions, certainly just pop it in the Q&A and I'll just read them off. But if cannabis is rescheduled, will we be including all forms in the prescription monitoring program as prescriptions?
You know what? That is a huge question, and I think it really all depends on each state and what what it includes. I think there are some states that will require, for example, all Schedule 2s and all Schedule 3s to be reported. There are some states that maybe specify reporting for only certain particular controlled substances within certain schedules. One of the things that I think is going to be very important should DEA reschedule cannabis is to be very specific exactly about what it's rescheduling. Is it only rescheduling natural THC in cannabis? Is it rescheduling THC content derived from hemp? For example, Delta 8 THC. And what about synthetic THC? Will that also be, within the scheduling or rescheduling purview? A lot of questions. And I think one of the problems with the Agricultural Act of 2014 and 2018 is that it left a few loopholes.
Okay, another question. Should this legislation play out and marijuana were to be placed into Schedule 3, do you feel there would be an increase in research and development activities from well-established pharmaceutical companies? I know who that came from.
I would certainly hope so. I think certainly for years, the researchers and academic institutions, basically said that DEA only having one marijuana cultivator for 50 years really kind of held back research because there were questions about the grades, about the varieties of the cannabis. So, obviously with more cultivators and with DEA continuing to increase aggregate production quotas, I certainly hope, whether it's rescheduled to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, that research continues at the pace that appears to be going at.
Okay, and another, I'm not sure if this is an editorial comment or something that they're looking for you to come. Please state synthetically created cannabis is illegal regardless of potency. Not sure what that means.
Please state it.
Please?
I think in order to respond, think I think synthetic CBD, there has been a question within DEA as to whether it's controlled or not, regardless of its THC content. I think that question has been ongoing, and I think know where the questioner is coming from on that. But there has been some question about that.
Okay, and let me just see if there's any other questions. Oh, there's two more. What are some of the challenges or opportunities, if any, that state medical cannabis programs should be considering as a result of rescheduling?
Wow. I think there may be some great opportunities. I am not real familiar with any of the research that has come out to date. But, I certainly think that there is, potential for, perhaps, expanding the qualifying medical conditions that, a number of states have in place right now. But I do think that, with increased research and studies that potential will certainly increase.
Okay, and oh, we've got a lot of good questions. Actually, Larry and I were talking earlier. We think like if depending on what happens, we may have to have another webinar down the road. If this moves to a Schedule 3, would the DEA require registration for the dispensing facilities allowed in certain states?
I think DEA would require that. That would be required under the CSA. And right now, depending on the state and, kind of the policy that has been in place, kind of consistent with the Cole memo, DEA has kind of laid back. But I do think if DEA reschedules to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, I think DEA will certainly require DEA registrations in those states. And, as I said, would require prescriptions to dispense to individuals.
All right, and last, oh boy, we have, okay. So thank you for your presentation. We submitted a Freedom of Information Act as well and will likely appeal it as the response was inadequate. We are most curious regarding new data since 2016. If able to say, are you pursuing further engagement on your FOIA?
I don't think we are. I think, we're just, it is what it is, and we're kind of just, kind of waiting to see what happens. I've been kind of hearing rumblings that DEA may be coming forth with an announcement in the very near future. Okay,
so I think, Carrie, I think we're ready to wrap it up. I will just tell everybody that the recording from today's presentation will be sent out to everybody. So really appreciate everybody's attention, most especially Larry's presentation, which obviously garnered a lot of attention.
Yes, once again, thank you, Larry, for that wonderful presentation. I don't know if I have more answers now than I did before to some of my questions, but it all remains kind of a big question mark, I think, in everyone's mind until it actually happens and you see the law.
No, I think that's very true. I think, more questions and speculation has kind of been ginned up with HHS's recommendation to Schedule 3 than really answering any questions. I'm still, curious as to how cannabis is now has an accepted use in medical treatment in the United States. I'm really curious about that. And I'm really curious to see how DEA is going to continue to handle our obligations as a signatory to the single convention. There's certain things we can and can't do as a signatory, but maybe DEA will get creative.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, Larry. Thanks, Kathy. It's been another excellent NASCA webinar. So on behalf of the National Association of State-Controlled Substance Authorities, I would like to thank everyone who joined us for today's call. And thank you to our sponsors for making the webinar possible. We wish you a wonderful and productive rest of your day. And thanks again, Larry.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.